96 in Livernois area.
And how long did that call last?
That call was 12 seconds in duration.
And I would like to skip ahead to December 14th. And I believe that Mr. Brack's calls start for December 14th on page 15.
That is correct, ma'am.
Does the phone number associated with Mr. Brack interact with multiple towers on that day?
It does, ma'am.
How many towers?
It interacts, I'm sorry, with one tower, but two different sectors of that one tower.
Okay. And what is that tower, sir?
That is 2208.
And is that the tower that services the area of 18541 Fielding?
That is correct.
Would that tower service a house that's across the street from 18541 Fielding?
Yes, it would.
Now, I would like to refer your attention to page 18. And you've indicated by the red line the point where Ms. Globe's body was found. Is there any call activity on Mr. Brack's phone after that?
After that call, the phone associated to Mr. Brack ceases to communicate with the Sprint network. The last call being 3:46 p.m. on the 14th.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sure.
What's the range of number of phone calls made by the deceased over the course of these runs? How many a day? Do you have any idea of that?
I could only give you that answer for December 11th.
Okay.
On December 11th, until the 8 o'clock p.m. time, or 8:01, there was 102 exchanges between her phone and the network with some other device or some other phone.
Do you know how many of those are to Mr. Brack's number on that day?
Yes, sir. There is a total of 20 between the two devices.
Have you searched the records of any of the other devices with which the phone we're now talking about communicated?
Yes, sir.
Can you identify those numbers? Are they included in the records that were produced?
Yes. The number 313-465-9535.
And who is that associated with?
That is associated to what was described to me as the boyfriend of the victim.
That would be John Black? Is that what you understand that to be?
That is correct, sir. I believe that is correct.
And how many phone calls in that day to him?
approximately 29 until that 8 p.m. time frame.
You don't know his whereabouts during the course of that day, do you, other than in relationship to where the phone was, the device was, right?
That is correct.
Same thing with Mr. Brack. You don't know where he was or what he was doing during the time depicted in any of these communications.
That's correct. I cannot say who's on the other end of the phone.
And of course, the contents of those telephone calls are not related in any way by your analysis, not contained in your analysis.
Yes, sir. I have no information on the content.
Do you know anything about the number of phone calls that might have been made, that were made? Oh, and John Black, was the location of his device often during those calls in the Lathrop Village area? Could you identify that?
That would be correct, sir.
And sometimes out of the Lathrop Village area?
I don't recall offhand. I do recall that it was in that area for the analysis that I conducted on his phone.
But it might also have been calls from Mr. Black's phone device emanating from outside of the Lathrop cell tower area.
That is possible. I can say for certain that it was not consistent with being in the area of the homicide scene.
Okay. Say that last again. You can't say what?
The phone associated to Mr. Black on December 11th did not place any calls that were consistent with it being at the scene of the homicide.
I see. But it can be associated with being at places associated with the deceased.
I can't answer that, sir. I'm not sure of what places you're referring to. I don't know. I don't even know the victim's residence.
You don't really know when the deceased went missing, actually, do you?
That's actually a difficult question. On a cell phone analysis standpoint, I've reviewed hundreds of homicide victims' phones, and they all do the exact same thing. They cease to communicate with the network on or about the time of their demise.
On or about the time of their demise, or on or about the time that they go missing, or are they the same in your conception of this problem?
Well, the missing is a different factor in reference to just homicide victims' phones. When they become the victim of a homicide, their phones generally just continue to make outgoing calls or cease to communicate with the network altogether. And that is a very standard pattern.
Okay. The time of her demise, you're not, well, the location of where she was found. What is the cell phone pattern around that area? Is there anything of her cell phone that relates to the area where she was found on Fielding?
Her cell phone's last communications are consistent with her being at the homicide scene, where the scene took place and where she was recovered.
Are there any cell phone analysis or text message analysis of the family members, like the mother's cell phone, in communication with the deceased?
No, sir. Not that I had done.
That wasn't searched, is what you're saying. That wasn't analyzed.
I have not performed any analysis on any other numbers than the three we
ones that
spoke
we've
of.
talked about.
That is correct.
Okay. What numbers were associated with the Fifth Third Bank?
1-782-0279.
And whose number is that?
The Fifth Third Bank.
And who called? Who communicated with that bank?
The victim's phone communicated with that number twice, both for approximately 3 minutes, one just before 8 p.m. and then once at 1 minute 46 seconds after 8 p.m. on December 11th, 2015.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect? Very briefly, Your Honor. Referring to Exhibit 58, Mr. Brack's cell records, I would draw yours and the court's attention to page 9, item 385. We have a call highlighted in orange.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and looking at maps 1 and 5, could you explain what that area is, sir?
Yes, ma'am. The calls on line, or item 385, highlighted in orange, is serviced by a cell tower that is in the area of Telegraph and Finkel, as well as the corresponding calls after 385 by that same cell tower, but the sector that is shaded in purple. And finally, item 391 is a call at 9:29 p.m. on December 12th, which is a cell tower and sector that's shaded in green on the maps.
And on the maps, you have another, call out.
Yes, there is the location of 15378 Chatham, which is where the victim's vehicle was recovered.
And on Exhibit 57, Ms. Globe's call report, is there any calls, whether incoming or outgoing, that correspond with that orange sector?
No, ma'am.
Nothing further.
Could I follow up on something that was raised just a moment ago? I think
Very briefly.
absolutely. The Chatham Street Tower, there was a call emanating or going to that tower?
There's actually 2 towers that service calls around that time.
Yes.
One being in the general area of Telegraph and 5 Mile, and the other being in the area of Losser and 6 Mile. Those calls are from the defendant's phone, all outgoing calls.
Do you know to what?
Yes, sir. The first one is to the number 313-204-4424.
And that number belongs to?
I do not know, sir.
Okay.
The second one is to 313-768-6275. And from a public record search, that number is associated to a Linda Cloud. Then there are 2 more calls to that first 204 number. And then a call to the number 248-785-8482. And that number from a public record database search is associated to an R. Williams. And then a outgoing call to the 204 number again. And finally, an outgoing call to the number associated to an R. Williams.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sergeant McGinnis, you are excused. Any additional witnesses for the people? No, Your Honor. Okay, Mr. Weissman, are you calling any witnesses?
No, we are not.
Okay, thank you. Then the people may proceed with their motion. Your Honor, at this time, if people would move to bind over on the certain count of open murder. With regards,
I'm going to ask you to use the microphone so I'm able to hear you.
how's this?
Not really.
How about that?
That's better. Thank you.
No problem. In this case, we have a 24-year-old woman who the family realizes that she's missing on December 11, 2015. They can't formally make a report until the early morning hours of December 12th, but they know it's not like her to come home, to not come home, to not call or not return calls or return texts. And in this case, she's not doing any of those things. We've heard from her sister who said she instructs Ms. Globe's boyfriend, to Mr. John Black, to go through her cloud to see if there are any outgoing calls that may be an indication of where she might be, and the only thing they find is a video from December 7th. What we also have is the car that Ms. Globe was last seen in, a gold Impala that is recovered in the early morning hours of December 14th in the area of Chatham near Keeler. And we had the recovering officer testify that that area is basically vacant houses and empty lots. There's nothing over there. They perform an extensive canvass of the area. They use cadaver and canine dogs, and yet there are negative results. And we also know from her calls report that she never makes any calls or receives any calls from that area. Also, we know that on the evening of December 14th, Ms. Globe's body was found in the rear of 18541 Fielding, a vacant house inside a city dumpster. We heard from Ms. Morrell, who identified that that house is vacant, and it has been vacant for quite some time. And we heard from Officer Fitzhugh that the dumpster was actually located behind a tree in the backyard, and there were branches around it that did not fall naturally. We heard from Dr. Lokman Sung that said although he could not definitively state a cause of death, he went through the protocol to eliminate any other causes of death, even though he ruled the manner homicide. And he basically said, we have an objectively suspicious circumstance of the body, of the death, the body being deliberately hidden from view. There are no anatomic causes of death. There's no toxicologic cause of death. They ran 2 extensive screens of her toxicology, and basically they found minimal alcohol, caffeine, and chocolate.
Chocolate or diet meds?
Chocolate or diet meds, excuse me. And Dr. Sun testified that none of those contributed to Ms. Globe's death. Dr. Sun testified there was no environmental, circumstantial, or historical causes of her death, and he did review her medical history, and for all intents and purposes, she was a healthy 24-year-old woman. A more specific cause of death could not be suggested, but Dr. Lokman did testify, Dr. Lokman's son, excuse me, did testify that there are forms of asphyxia, specifically smothering, that do not leave or may not leave external or internal injuries, and that is contained in his report, which is marked as Exhibit 1. I believe we have probable cause to believe that a crime was committed in this case. Now, with refers to who committed the crime, we have calls reports. And the last calls made and received by Ms. Globe, it interacts with the tower that's serviced by where Mr. Brack was living, which was right across the street, essentially, from 18541 Fielding. He was living at 18532 Fielding. We have a witness who sees Mr. Brack wheel a city dumpster across the street and place it in front of this yellow house, this yellow vacant house, the only yellow house on the street, and he's standing there talking on the phone, which, if the court looks at Exhibit 58, on December 14th, all the calls interact only with that tower, 2208. And the witness noted that that was weird, because usually people just bring their dumpsters out and then they go back in the house or go about their business. She also testified that later she sees the defendant take the dumpster from in front of the yellow house and wheel it into the rear of that vacant house. And then he comes back out with a dumpster. And then she sees him later walking off. We have a supervisor from Advanced Waste Disposal who gets a call from an employee reporting of a possible body in a dumpster. And he goes over to the area because he says the employee refuses to go period. She says, I'm not dumping anything, I don't want to find anything. So he goes, Mr. Stafford goes, and he said he walked up and down both sides of the street, looking in every dumpster on both sides, and what he notes is he sees someone who fits the build of Mr. Brack standing on the yellow house watching. Now, Mr. Stafford was very upfront with this court, and he says, I wouldn't recognize him if I saw him again, but he was able to give a physical description. And as the court would know, Officer Crosby testified there's only one yellow house on that block. Also, referring to Exhibit 58, we have Mr. Brack's cell records, which it corresponds to the area where Ms. Globe's car is ultimately discovered, and the outgoing call was placed on December 12th at 9 p.m., which the court, I believe, can take judicial notice that it's nighttime, it's December, and this is already a desolate area. Also, Mr. Brack's phone ceases to communicate with any tower at the moment that Ms. Globe's body is found directly across the street from where he's living. And lastly, Your Honor, Ms. Globe's body, and also in the dumpster with Ms. Globe's body are 2 trash bags containing what Officer Fitzhugh testified as filler material. One is on top of her body and one is underneath her body. And Officer Fitzhugh stated that when he also went over to 18532 Fielding, he also saw that same type of filler material in the basement. I believe that is probable cause to believe that the defendant has committed the crime, and I will ask the court to bind over.
Okay, thank you. In response?
Yes, Your Honor. It is a circumstantial evidence case. No one can identify Mr. Brack as being the killer. We don't really know how she died. This statement in the ME's report that asphyxia victims sometimes show no evidence of foul play on their body is just a suggestion. It is not an opinion to a reasonable degree of forensic science certitude that asphyxia was the cause of death in this case. It's just another possibility. They have no idea. It strikes me odd that this circumstantial evidence case, prosecution keeps saying in the course of their presentation that the garbage can was hidden from view. It's a curious choice of characterization of that phrase, hidden from view. The fact of the matter is, the important part of hiding something from view is always so you can't find it and point to a culprit. But here, hidden from view really has the canister across the street, pointing with a great big finger back across the street to where Mr. Brack was living with a woman. That's hardly hidden from view. That's something that's pointing, and it's what the prosecution means to ask this court to infer. It points directly at Mr. Brack having done this. But why? Why would anybody put a garbage can containing a body there, except to have it point at a suspect? Rather, if someone else, and not Mr. Brack, killed, and with a real motive, perhaps, and opportunity, perhaps, to kill Kajavia, wanted it to point away from the killer and to Mr. Brack, where would you put the can? I submit you'd put the can across the street from Mr. Brack. It's really this kind of thing that is very much the quality of all of the prosecution's evidence. These phone calls going back and forth, their number, their frequency, the locations from which they emanated or were received. These people all lived in this area. And notice the absence, really, of any kind of analysis of the calls of John Black, who also had great opportunity, and apparently, one could say, although no real evidence of it was presented, some real motive to hurt Kajavia, given that he is in receipt of a video depicting sex acts between Mr. Black and Kajavia being taken by Kajavia. How much of a real investigation was done into John Black's whereabouts, activities, cell phone activity, on and on? Indeed, the family itself, to raise a horrible suggestion that this is frightfully missing evidence in this case. And indeed, you will remember, please, that Tina Morell first made a statement, I believe, on January 22nd, well over a month after this event is said to have happened, on whatever date and time it really is said to have happened, because that's not entirely clear. Waited over a month, had been shown in that interim on numerous occasions, photographs of Mr. Black.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. That's not on this record.
I don't know if you saw me raise the eyebrow, but I'm going to let everybody do the job that they're supposed to do. Counsel, you're indicating information, or you're placing information in your response, and none of those proofs were placed into this record, and let the record clearly reflect that I gave everyone the opportunity to present their witnesses. And so you have to stick with what has been placed before this court.
Will do, Your Honor. And those will be matters to be discussed more fully at another time.
And we're not going to discuss them today. Thank you. Next.
It is the defense's contention that there is insufficient evidence to bind over, that the examination and investigation were incomplete at best, and only circumstantially point and incompletely point to Mr. Brack.
Okay, thank you. It's the people's motion. You get the last opportunity.
Well, Your Honor, I believe my original argument still stands, but I would like to note that Sergeant McGinnis did testify that he analyzed John Black's phone records, and he was not in the area of 18541 Fielding at the time Ms. Globe's phone ceased all tower communication. And also, I would note that December 11th, December 14th was a Monday, and as Mr. Stafford testified, that was trash day for that area. And so it would make sense for a witness to see Mr. Brack pulling the trash can out and putting it in front of a house, because maybe he expected for the dumpster, the trucks to just pick it up and take her away and nobody would ever find her.
Okay, thank you. I'm ready to make my ruling. I've had the opportunity to review my notes the last time that the parties were here and the witnesses were called by the people, as well as the testimony that I've listened to on today. And you're right, Mr. Weitzman, The first thing that I must show, or that the people must show by a probable cause standard, is that there was a homicide. Unrefuted testimony from Dr. Song was that he classified this particular case as a homicide, and he was very clear, as a matter of fact, that this was a 24-year-old, otherwise healthy female whose body had been hidden from view, who showed no anatomic causes for death, who showed no toxicological causes for death, no environmental causes for death, and there was no other reasonable cause for death with respect to the victim. And so he determined that this was, in fact, a homicide. It was also clarified for the record that asphyxiation or asphyxia may have been the possibility of death, and that it is possible that a person can be asphyxiated and there be no visible signs. And the doctor was very clear that he used this 5-prong test as an expert, as an assistant medical examiner, to determine that it was a homicide. And so because the victim failed within satisfied all 5 prongs of the test, clearly it is a homicide. The second thing that the people must show is that Mr. Brack is the person that caused the death of the victim. The evidence or the information that has been placed on this record is very clear to this court that there was communication between the victim as well as the defendant during the times and questions. And I will tell you that initially the people's first few witnesses, I sat and kept making a note. They haven't made the connection. They haven't made the connection. And then the people called Miss Morrell, who was the neighbor who dared to get involved, who picked up the phone and told the police what she saw. And she is the person that put this case together. She did not know the defendant. She did not know the victim. She clearly described the defendant, and she also picked him out of a lineup after having had no interaction with the defendant whatsoever. And so she is the person that places the defendant on Fielding Street with that trash can, moving it to the front of a vacant house, the only yellow house on the block, on Fielding, where the crime took place, or where the deceased body was found. Miss Morrell places the defendant there, moving that trash can to the front of the property, to the back of the property, to the front of the property, and back to the back of the property again. Also, it was clear from the exhibits that the people placed into the record that the debris that was found in front of the trash can was not natural debris. It was debris that was placed there by someone who was trying to conceal what they had done. And in this case, Mr. Brack, you were trying to conceal that you had, in fact, at least from a probable cause standard, for this court, killed Miss Kajavia Globe. And so don't do it in my courtroom, please. If you can't contain your emotions, step out if you want to leave a free person today. And so based on all of the evidence that I've heard, I am finding that the people have, in fact, met their burden. I'm binding the defendant over as charged. The arraignment on the information will be March 3rd, 2016 at 9 o'clock a.m. And of course, the defendant is remanded. Anything else on behalf of the people?
No, Your Honor.
Anything else on behalf of the defendant, Mr. Weitzman?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, you're excused. And for those individuals that are in the audience, I am going to ask you to remain seated until my deputies can tell you how to leave the courtroom. Thank you so much for your cooperation. Just indulge me for a few minutes.
Thank you. You ready? What are you doing? Good morning. How are you? Good. Are you prosecuting?
Thank you.
Your name, Mr. Like you.
Do you have 36 case numbers?
Yeah.
62558.
Come on, come in, have a seat.